Okay, well, welcome everyone to tonight's global webcast about the challenges of gluten-free eating. Your speaker tonight is Laura Lavalle, the Director of Nutrition and Dietetics at Progressive Medical Center of Orange County. Laura is also the Vice President of Nutrition and Dietetic Programs at Metabolic Code Enterprises, Inc. Laura has a Bachelor's of Science degree in Nutrition and Dietetics from the University of Akron and is a licensed and registered dietitian who has completed Level 2 certificate training in adult weight management through the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. Laura has helped develop a line of low glycemic, gluten-free frozen meals for Artisan Bistro Pro Direct and helped train Lifetime Fitness dietitians on the usage of the metabolic code as a comprehensive weight management tool for clients. Laura's education and work experience focuses on her commitment to two primary goals: helping people have the knowledge and tools to see the difference that good nutrition can make in their lives, and furthering healthcare in the United States toward a system that better utilizes proven dietary supplements for both health and wellness and better management of health conditions. Without further delay, here's Laura Lavalle to present the challenges of gluten-free eating. Go ahead, Laura.
Thank you, John. Thanks so much. I'd like to welcome everybody, and as John said, we're so pleased for such a great turnout for the webinar. It shows tremendous interest in this topic. So since we're late, let's just get going and start right in with slide number 1, gluten-free diets, challenges and issues. So we'll move on to our first slide, which sort of discusses some of the gluten sensitivity numbers that are going on right now. The numbers are going up, with current estimates being 1 in 100 having gluten sensitivity, contrasted with 1 in 10,000 having celiacs, and 1 in 50 with digestive disorders testing positive for celiac. So that's sort of another way of looking at any digestive disorder. If you took all the people with any, whether it's irritable bowel disease or irritable bowel syndrome, different forms of colitis, whatever the digestive disorder, and you tested them, up to 1 in 50 would actually test positive for celiac. And 50% of people with inflammatory bowel disease have gluten sensitivity. So that estimate is a more current number according to Dr. Badani, who runs Cyrex Labs. That is his estimate based on the people that send in samples for lab testing through his lab, Cyrex Labs. That is much higher than what you'll see in the literature. You'll see in the literature that possibly 25% of people with inflammatory bowel disease have gluten sensitivity. And our personal experience is that it's higher than that 25% number as well. So we'll go on to the next slide. When we look at just the definition that's currently going on for a celiac diagnosis, it's anyone with positive anti-gliadin antibodies as well as transglutaminase antibodies, and with a positive HLA-DQ2, DQ8 genotype. Non-celiac, the definition is it'll be negative for transglutaminase, but positive for IgA or IgG very often, not always, for IgA antibodies or IgG antibodies against gliadin. Interestingly, some of the non-celiac people will have one or the other DQ2 or DQ8 that they'll be positive for sometimes as well. What I like what's going on now on this front is that we're getting more and more testing that is being developed to help understand where all these gluten sensitivities may be coming from. We have labs developing antibody testing for different gliadin fractions. They're identifying all of the gliadin fractions, which gliadin is part of the protein within gluten itself, developing testing for glutenins, We have testing for IgG complement proteins. We have some labs that are testing for presence of antibodies in stool. So more and more testing is getting developed, and that's good news because then we don't have to have everybody just lumped into this. What we currently have going on is just this large group of patients that end up wanting to do a gluten-free diet to see if it might be an explanation for some of their health issues. And they know they react, but we just really don't know what it is. And this may eventually, help with things like insurance reimbursement for healthcare for these issues. So it's all progressing and very nicely. So we'll go on to the next slide. On gluten-free diets, what I wanted to discuss tonight, so those previous slides just kind of give you the background of increasing numbers. And for those of us who work in integrative practices, we see many, many, many people that benefit from gluten-free diets, even way beyond these numbers. So as practitioners and in integrative practices, especially when we're trying to help our clients implement these diets, most of you who've tried it can testify to the fact that there can be some difficulties involved. And one of the big things that I hear too frequently from practitioners or especially from patients is that they've tried gluten-free diet and they didn't notice any difference. And we think we may have some reasons for why. And part of that, if they say it doesn't make any difference, it depends on, first of all, what they were doing the gluten-free diet for. Were they trying it for weight loss, or were they trying it for management of a condition such as irritable bowel syndrome? So I want to go over what might make the diet, quote unquote, not work for your client, for whatever issue that they're trying to do the diet for. So the big three areas that come up why the gluten-free diet might not be successful are related to these three areas: carb load and sugar issues. Are they really eliminating all the gluten? Are they still allowing too much gluten in there? Or could hidden gluten be affecting them? And then another issue that just tends to come up is, the diet's expensive, and I have a few pointers in here for some ways to help control some of the costs that can be incurred by trying to implement a gluten-free diet. I wanted to just quickly define, when we say a gluten-free diet, what are we trying to accomplish? What do we need to do? What do we not eat, and what can we eat? So on a gluten-free diet, the main sources, by far and away, wheat. Very few people eat rye bread anymore, and it always has wheat in it. But rye and barley are also gluten-containing grains. Kamut is another blend between rye and wheat. There's another grain that I don't have listed on here called triticale that contains gluten, and spelt also contains gluten. So when people are trying to avoid gluten in the diet, the main thing is to avoid all the wheat foods made with wheat and wheat flour. So pasta, bread, baked goods, breaded foods. They can use gluten-free versions of those types of foods. What they're going to center the majority of their diet around are their protein foods, vegetables, both starchy and some non-starchy vegetables, which is all of your, leafy greens, green beans, carrots, broccoli, cauliflower, all of those. Nuts and seeds. They can eat some fruit, and then their non-gluten containing grains like rice, quinoa, millet, amaranth, buckwheat, and potatoes. Oats are always the big question on gluten-free diets. What about oats? There's a misunderstanding because in the early phases of implementing celiac, diets for celiac disease a number of years ago, it was found that a lot of patients were experiencing abdominal pain, for example, or other symptoms when they ate oats. And they began to find out that there is some cross-contamination that occurs in granaries when they're trying to separate out oats. And so you can have some very, very small amounts, really more like wheat dust almost, that that will contaminate the oats. So this was the old theory, is that it could be cross-contaminated. Oats themselves do not contain gluten. However, I've got some information further on in our slides that will help explain this, but what they're finding out now is that there are components in grains called lectins that could be causing some cross-reactivity between not only oats, but some other grains, including amaranth and quinoa, that therefore, and I've seen this a lot with patients in clinical practice, you'll have some celiac patients that just don't seem to tolerate certain grains. And that's a matter of some trial and error, and there is a lab that tests for that cross-reactivity now. So anyway, but when it comes to just good old-fashioned oats, some people don't tolerate them, whether it's from cross-contamination or from the lectin issue. So the first area that I want to cover on the challenges of gluten-free diets is this issue of comorbidities. What it comes down to is trying to implement a gluten-free diet for improvement of symptoms or weight loss. Part of the issue may be that the client has sensitivity to other food allergens and they just don't realize it, and they need to be eliminated as well. And in this scenario, the most common food allergen that's a problem is cow's milk and any food made from cow's milk. So we'll go through some of the statistics on the next slide, discussing what the literature says on this. For example, we know with celiac patients, we have a very high rate of people with celiacs that also have lactose intolerance. And this basically just happens because as they get the autoimmune attack against the villi of the intestine, they lose the capability of making lactase in the cells of the small intestine that can do that, and therefore they don't digest it and break it down, and it becomes fodder for gut flora, which will be then fermented, and that's part of the reason for the tremendous amount of gas formation. So we know that this occurs in celiacs. I had referred to Dr. Vidani before, who some of you may be familiar with through the Gluten Summit. His estimate is that 50% of the people with gluten sensitivity are also sensitive to cow's milk. That's a very high number. So this is celiac or non-celiac, 50% of the people also sensitive to cow's milk. And there's also high cross-reactivity between yeast, eggs, corn, millet, and oats. So when you send in for lab tests through them, they test for cross-reactivity with these other foods to find out what the lab tests say. And then Entera labs have discovered that in 75% of colitis patients, they will test positive for anti-gliadin antibodies, and 25% asymptomatic volunteers test positive as well. And I actually should have included this statistic back with the other slides, where when we talk about the huge people who may need gluten-free diet, this was a interesting find. It was a life-changing find for Dr. Fine, that asymptomatic people, or seemingly asymptomatic, are walking around with gluten sensitivity, antibodies to gliadin and gluten. But the biggest point here is the cross-reactivity between people with gluten sensitivity and other food allergens, and in particular, cow's milk. When you look at the incidence of food allergies or sensitivities, the two most problematic foods by far are wheat and cow's milk dairy. And then even the statistics in the studies are starting to show that if people are going to have a problem with another food allergen, the vast majority of the time, it'll be to cow's milk. Okay, next slide. We have 25% of patients with irritable bowel syndrome have hypersensitivity to wheat and dairy, not just wheat. This was based on a study that was done and published in a Clinical Gastroenterology and Hepatology in November of 2011. And what they had the IBS patients do was an elimination diet. And they eliminated both wheat and dairy. And then they did as you do with a elimination diet, they had them do a reintroduction of those foods and monitor their symptoms. And this included IBS patients that had both alternating constipation and diarrhea or diarrhea dominant type irritable bowel. And so what they did was they also looked for possible markers in fecal samples that could be correlated with the incidence of hypersensitivity to the foods. And they found that they had elevated levels of tryptase as well as eosinophil cationic protein, or ECP. So it was just kind of a side note to the fact that the people had sensitivity and trying to develop testing for other markers of sensitivity. So it was an interesting study. Okay, the next slide. One of the things that I'll be sharing, I want to share from literature, but I also want to share from just my own personal experience, having worked in integrative medicine clinics now for about 15 years. And I just wanted to explain, what we end up using the elimination diet aspect for, care of our patients, and it ends up being quite a few different diagnoses or conditions or issues that people are dealing with. And basically, what we kind of lump it into is what we refer to as a gut dominant type condition, or a condition that tends to flow from this root issue of gut dysbiosis and loss of gut integrity, or leaky gut syndrome, whatever wording you want to put to what happens with the onset of dysbiosis, meaning an imbalance of friendly and unfriendly gut flora, and everything that flows from that down through to the loss of tight junction proteins, to the hyperimmunity. So just to give you a idea of all the symptoms that can be related to gut dysbiosis issue. Anybody our questionnaire has a question on it that we simply ask, do you experience a lot of gas after meals? And especially people will, oh yes, definitely, and they'll notice that it especially tends to be in response to high carbohydrate foods very often, sugary or high carb foods like grains. So just the presence of a lot of gas after they eat. Anybody with allergies, anybody with kind of unexplained or explained joint aches and pains, anything that's known now to be an autoimmune condition such as Hashimoto's thyroiditis, any IBS, chronic sinus issues flow from Candida albicans yeast dysbiosis, unexplained headaches, fatigue, asthma, eczema, and other skin rash problems, psoriasis, even multiple sclerosis, which of course is sort of lumped into autoimmunity. Many of our metabolic syndrome cases, so people that are dealing with issues with insulin resistance, weight gain that ends up putting on that belly fat, high blood pressure, all that metabolic syndrome suite of issues are very often helped by also, in our clinic we use the primary thing for that diet-wise is we help them ratchet down their carb load, glycemic load of their diet, but many will also be helped by elimination of food allergens, and I've got some slides later on that may explain why. Sleep issues, a lot of times we don't stop to think about an elimination diet possibly helping sleep. But if people happen to be having histaminic, more prototypical IgE response to food allergens, histamine is somewhat excitatory and disruptive of sleep. And then, of course, with weight loss, because when people are reactive to food allergens, it is a tremendous source of internal inflammation and can contribute to insulin-resistant weight gain. So it can be extremely helpful for weight loss as well. So again, going from our experience, here's what we find. If we're talking about out and out population of people that are known to have high incidence of gluten sensitivity. And of course, with celiacs, it's all about gluten sensitivity, but they may have the comorbidity of lactose intolerance or dairy sensitivity, other type of immune sensitivity to cow's milk. So we just find from experience that most patients do much better with removal of cow's milk, at least in the initial phases of trying to get their condition managed. So at least for the first few months until you can get some healing of the gut linings after, a few months of gluten avoidance. And we do find that many of them may tolerate dairy foods down the road. Definitely our IBS patients do much better removing both wheat and dairy. Interestingly, if I had to put a percentage on this, I would say that IBS patients tend to have dairy as their worst sensitivity, with wheat following. But when I'm going to try to manage the condition, I need both wheat and dairy out. And what we've ended up doing is, just because there's such high cross-reactivity between these two food allergens, if I can get other clients with other conditions or issues that they're dealing with to go ahead and remove both of them, that's what I try to do. Once in a while, if we get people that just are very resistant on one or the other, we'll try to do it one at a time. But it's much more effective to do removal of both of the food allergens from the very beginning, because if either one is a problem, even if it's just a minor problem, it makes it hard to get results if you don't have it removed from the diet as well. And then you can do a reintroduction of the food later on to determine. So when we reviewed the gluten-containing foods that need removed, but when we're talking about dairy, what are we talking about? You do have to define it, because we tend to lump dairy and cow's milk in the same boat. As a clinician, I know when we say dairy, we're really just talking about cow's milk, but there's kind of an old-fashioned thing that dairy might be eggs as well, anything that comes from the dairy farm. People lump milk and eggs together. We're not talking about eggs, we're talking about cow's milk. So, yogurt, a lot of people don't drink much milk anymore. They may have occasional ice cream, but yet they use yogurt a lot for breakfast. So you have to find a replacement or eliminate yogurt. If they do use milk, tends to be in adults just in coffee or on cereal. But whatever they might need or want milk for, they should switch to a cow's milk-free version. Almond milk, rice milk, or coconut milk are some of the most easy to find, but a lot of the stores now are carrying flax milk and hemp seed milk, and those are both fine as well. We have to find replacement for cheese. So there are almond milk-based cheeses now that are pretty decent. Rice milk cheeses aren't as easy to find. The veggie shreds and veggie cheeses that you see in stores are usually mostly soy-based. And then there's tapioca-based versions. The primary one is the brand called Daya. So on the diet that we use primarily in our clinic, our metabolic code diet, the initial phase has no yogurt, if we recommend using coconut milk, especially good in coffee, much better than almond milk in most people's opinion. If they need something in their coffee. and it uses Daiya cheese specifically. The reason we did that is because if people happen to know they have an almond allergy or want to avoid soy, so we use the Daiya. After a couple of weeks of having no milk from an animal source, we actually walk them through a step where they can treat eating of goat's milk, either goat's milk itself or goat's milk cheeses, as a food reintroduction and test themselves for sensitivity. There can be some cross-reactivity between goat's and sheep's milk and cow's milk. So if people are sensitive to cow's milk, once in a while they will also be sensitive to goat's and sheep's milk cheese. So that's the reason we do it that way. The reason is because of the types of casein that are in cow's milk. There is a much smaller amount, but goat's and sheep's milk do contain casein. So there are different types of casein and they're smaller amounts, but it just depends on how reactive the person is, if they'll also have a problem with the goat's or sheep's milk cheese. So when you're trying to implement this gluten and dairy free, the biggest mistake we see people making in their diet, they kind of forget what they're doing when they get home, and they don't tend to stop and think that if they dump some half and half in their coffee, that that's milk. Somehow they, you know, even though it's cream, it's from milk. It's from milk. I don't know why, but people just tend to make that mistake. So actually, if you have people that are stuck on something like Coffee Mate and non-dairy creamers, they are non-dairy. They're okay. They're not optimal just because of the high fructose corn syrup or corn syrup ingredients. They are actually now making some that don't use those ingredients, that use regular sugar instead, but we recommend coconut milk. It's easiest and healthiest, and it's getting pretty easy to find. They have to be preferably the non-flavored, because the vanilla or flavored ones add a lot of extra sugar, which is not the greatest for other reasons that we're going to go over in a minute. If you have people that like protein powders or especially protein bars, they have to look at those ingredients and make sure that there's no way that there's no milk proteins of different types or milk ingredients like non-fat milk powder. Okay, on the next slide, carb issues, glycemic, we're going to go over the carb issues. So just to kind of recap, the most important, one of the big issues that will affect people seeing results with the gluten-free diet is if they're eating cow's milk dairy, they're also sensitive to it and they never realized it. So a big recommendation of ours is, because we're now seeing numbers come back for so many people being cross-reactive, we just recommend, if you're going to go gluten-free, it's a good idea to take the cow's milk dairy out as well. The second issue that can come up with implementing a gluten-free diet successfully is this issue of glycemic load and the issue of having too much sugar in the diet. For those of you that have seen clients implementing gluten-free diets, what is the tendency to do? Just take anything made with wheat and find the gluten-free alternative. So whether it's their pasta, their bread, their cakes, cookies, brownies, pancakes, waffles, there's a gluten-free version, but those are very high glycemic load foods, and they can have some issues. So they will stop people from being successful or getting results on the diet, and we'll explain why. The first and most obvious is if a person is trying to use a gluten-free diet to lose weight and they just switch up from one high glycemic load food to another high glycemic load food, and they don't do anything to take the edge off of that carb intake and therefore the insulin production and the ability to lose weight. You know, one of the biggest issues that's been identified as, you know, very, very much a lifestyle thing that raises a person's health risks, it's the glycemic load or the total carb content of a meal. And so all the studies that have been done on anti-inflammatory diets, they're finding ways to reduce that dysglycemia that occurs after a meal. So glycemic load is an extremely important issue, an extremely important health issue. And it's important for anyone, whether they're really trying to lose weight or not, but especially for weight management. So that's one of the big mistakes that people make, is they think just switch out the gluten and they don't do anything to reduce the carb load. So that'll definitely stop the weight loss results in a lot of people and almost everybody. The other issue that the reason why our carb intake is an issue is this issue of the gut dysbiosis, and in particular yeast issues. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you'll have some people with diagnosed celiacs. Very often they're slender or they're underweight. And we still need to address this gut dysbiosis issue. So what do we do about that? If we want to have them take down their sugar and carb load for the gut dysbiosis, what do we do for that? So we'll go through the next slides and go through this in more detail. We pretty much treat every celiac patient on our gut protocol, which means we work to address gut dysbiosis, an imbalance between Candida albicans yeast organisms and beneficial flora. And it was interesting to find that there was actually, it's in the literature that in fact it's theorized that by some people that Candida albicans overgrowth could possibly be a trigger for the onset of celiac disease. So what are some of the things that happen? What contributes to this gut dysbiosis? On the next slide, we start going into the reason, and it's just pretty much that we have so many patients that have a history of having to be on antibiotics for any number of things. It can be from childhood, where they experienced ear infections or tonsillitis, things like that, to getting put on antibiotics for acne, just any red-blooded American pretty much anymore has been on a few rounds of antibiotics. And what the studies are finding is that, we wipe out beneficial flora as well, but what the studies are finding, and we've always known that, but what's being, learned is that this beneficial flora gets wiped out and can take months and years to repopulate. Just left to your own devices, especially if you don't do anything to get them repopulated. And in fact, some studies have found that some of the strains never come back. So when we don't have our beneficial flora, then the Candida albicans organism that resides in human intestines overgrows, because no longer do you have the good bacteria there that the beneficial flora keep the populations of the Candida albicans down. And how we see this clinically is with well known that when people go on antibiotics and have to be on them, round after round, they will develop thrush or vaginal yeast infections or fungal toenails, or another symptom being heartburn. So this is the primary reason, but not the only one. On the next slide, we see a few other things that can contribute to this dysbiosis issue. Corticosteroid drugs, nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories, sugar in the diet and other diet composition, and I've got a good slide on that. Possibly pesticides. I don't have this added to the slide yet, but another big thing that can affect is apparently they're finding some artificial sweeteners, sucralose and saccharin, may kill off beneficial flora. Okay, the next slide. So if we get to where we have that overgrowth of yeast, we will get fermentation then. What they eat are sugars and starches, and that's just like when you do a pizza dough, when you have yeast in that flour, it bubbles up. It does the same in our intestines and creates gas. And this is so whenever we see a lot of gas and bloating after meals, especially if it's bad smelling, we know that we probably have an overgrowth of some yeast. The bigger problem is that those yeast organisms put out mycotoxins, which are very damaging to the intestinal cells. Not all the damage to intestines comes from the immune cells themselves. Some of it comes from yeast microorganisms, mycotoxins. And then this starts to contribute to the imbalance of immune response and the other side effects are things like acetaldehyde production, which can interfere with mood, mental clarity, and contribute to chemical sensitivity issues. So that's one of our screening questions when we're screening for gut dysbiosis is if people have chemical sensitivity, we know we need to work on their gut. On the next slide, these were some older studies I found that found dietary links to yeast overgrowth. And the question is if you just feed sugar, 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 does that tend to promote the yeast production? And at least in this one really older study, they looked at this. In particular, they were looking for, was there anything in the diet that tended to promote the development of vaginal yeast infections in women? And what they found was that high urinary sugar was correlated with more frequency of vaginal yeast infections, as well as intake of cow's milk dairy. The parentheses is my parentheses. My question was, back when the study was done, we were still using a lot more antibiotics in cows, dairy cows. So, and the residues do carry through in the milk of the antibiotics. So that was my parentheses. But a much more recent study and a much more recent area of research interest is really revisiting this again and looking at influence of our diet macronutrients and micronutrients for that matter, and looking to see what does it do to our gut flora. So what we're finding out now on gut flora is that they break down into two primary categories. The this is a hard one to say, Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes. Those are the two big phyla of beneficial flora. And then we have, our or not beneficial flora, but just gut flora. Then our beneficial flora is things like the Bifidobacterium and the Lactobacillus strains of Acidophilus, Lactobacillus rhamnosus, those types of strains. And most of these studies are actually mice studies, and what they've done is done things like manipulate the fat content in the diet, usually by adding oil, but not always. Sometimes they add milk fat, so it's kind of an animal fat. But anyway, just for a quick review, some of you may be learning, if you go to other integrative medicine conferences, that what they're finding out is a big problem in particular for cardiovascular disease and autoimmune conditions, are LPS-containing bacteria. And what they've found is that these LPS-containing bacteria are a big source of inflammation, internal inflammation, and health problems. So if you look at these results, you see that when they ratchet the diet up to be much higher in fat, and one of the things I forgot to explain, the Bifidobacterium, that's a beneficial strain. The Bacteroidetes is also, in general, linked with health benefits. And what they see is when they compare the gut flora of lean adults to obese adults, they find that lean subjects have a predominance of Bacteroidetes being much higher and lower firmicutes. In obese individuals, they have higher firmicutes and low bacteroidetes. So what they've now found out is that the firmicutes tend to make us absorb more fat from our diet and tend to be linked with higher blood lipids. So that's a switch in the gut flora that we don't want. Interestingly, on high sugar diet, they found higher rates, higher incidence, and more count of Clostridium difficile and perfringens. When another study looked at high fat and sugar lumped together, they found higher Clostridium and enterobacteria. When we had carb reduced, we had higher bacteroidetes, and when we had higher complex carb, like from plant foods, especially fruits and vegetables, we saw lower rates of different types of pathogenic bacteria and increased beneficial flora, especially the bifidobacterium, which is important for the expression of IgA, which, as long as it's not overproduced, is protective against food allergies. And when they had higher intake of milk fat, there was an increased incidence of proteobacteria, which is, when I looked this up, it's a tend to be all gram-negative bacteria, LPS containing bacteria, so an endotoxemic type of bacteria. Now, at the bottom of the slide, I have review article conclusion. This wasn't the entire conclusion of this study. This study was looking at the changes of this gut flora from diet changes. But one of the conclusions was that if we would pay more attention to early treatment of dysbiosis, we could probably go a long way toward helping address and slow the development of metabolic syndrome and the related cardiovascular disease that results from it. And that's the reason I wanted to include that was for my earlier slide where I said reduction of food allergens may help immensely with treatment of metabolic syndrome, and in fact, that's what we see in our patients. Possibly a large part of it from, milk proteins in particular. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So, what are we looking at when it comes to carb load? For yeast dysbiosis in particular, the most important factor is to control refined sugar intake. Sugar in particular promotes the growth of yeast. Now, when we look at starchy foods, when we look at especially like very refined flours, they also break down very quickly into glucose. So we also need to take the edge off on the starch intake as well. We do this, we put a real focus on this if we're looking to help the person lose weight. So we'll reduce sugar for sure, but also starch, and especially if we're looking at it for weight loss needs. And we also need to think about our fruit intake, just because from the simple sugar aspect, if we take in too much fruit and fruit juices, it could also tend to help prevent us from being as effective against yeast dysbiosis. So what we do in particular in our metabolic code diet is when weight loss is needed, we really take the edge off of that postprandial dysglycemia, and we try to reverse that insulin resistance by having no starchy foods in the diet except for beans for the first few weeks. It can be anywhere from just 2 weeks to, on up to as much as 6 weeks, just to help really reverse that insulin resistance depending on how bad it is in the person. Now, if we don't want to lose weight, we can keep a little bit of starch and a little bit of fruit in there. And that tends to be for, as I mentioned, especially like a celiac patient that's slender, that's too thin, that doesn't want to lose any more weight. We try not to go too extreme on the starch and fruit restriction. And we'll up the fat intake somewhat to try to help attenuate weight loss. Okay, so the first two points are to be more successful in gluten-free diets, we need to help patients understand that they could also be allergic to dairy and also eliminate cow's milk. And the second point is we also need to look at the total carb load for yeast dysbiosis and for weight management issues. How much of it is patients not being successful on gluten-free diet because they really just didn't eliminate all gluten? Really, it's most people, if they put their mind to avoiding gluten, they will do it. So it's something you have to be aware of, but really, I don't feel that for the vast majority of people, this is the biggest issue. However, we just want to make sure that, the celiac patients, and they know that they really need to be stringent. They need to do things like buy those really expensive cans of certified gluten-free oats. And they also need to be aware that even then they may not tolerate oats. They have to look at things like, for example, a lot of people don't know that there's a real common food ingredient called malted barley or barley malt, or if it just says malt, that's made from barley. Barley does contain some gluten. So for a celiac patient, they use malted barley in Rice Krispie cereal, for example. They would need to go, even though the main grain in Rice Krispies is rice, which is gluten-free, there's a gluten-containing ingredient in there. And so for a celiac patient, they would need to get a gluten-free version of a crisp rice cereal. Now, and this again is going on our experience. For other diagnoses, avoidance of wheat, rye, and barley and wheat is wheat flour, anything made with wheat flour is usually enough. So for example, I've got a person with metabolic syndrome, belly fat, their blood sugars are trending high and their blood pressure is starting to go up. And they're agreeing to do an elimination diet as lumped in with the carb control diet, and as a way to help manage the metabolic syndrome. Well, for that person, what I found, there's not the high level of reactivity. We usually don't have to go all the way to the gluten-free oats. They just, or gluten-free Rice Krispies. Getting the large, lion's share of the wheat out of the diet is enough, and same with the dairy. However, I do want to mention there are a few foods that you want to make sure that people watch when they eat it. Soy sauce in particular, because sushi is so popular nowadays as well. Soy sauce is made from fermented wheat and soy, not just soy. In order for a soy sauce to be gluten-free, they need to ask for tamari. Tamari is a soy sauce that is just fermented soy. People need to remember, if you're eating out in particular, if you eat at home and you want to make a gravy, you can use cornstarch, you can use a gluten-free agar flake or something like that. Very easy. But when you eat out, 9 times out of 10, they're going to be thickened with a wheat flour base. Another common mistake I see people making is using Ezekiel bread, which is from sprouted grains, and there are sprouted wheat grains in there as well. So you'll see people saying, I've been eating Ezekiel bread. So you got to watch for that. It is not gluten-free. I actually have had a couple patients that were taught that sourdough bread was the gluten wasn't a problem because what sours the bread is a beneficial flora strain, and they're told that it breaks down the gluten similar to bacteria breaking down lactose in yogurt, in milk-based yogurt. And the truth of the matter is it may break it down somewhat, but it doesn't get rid of the gluten. And then we have to have clients watch. I have seen some dark chocolate products that have wheat flours added to them. And then a big one is, people need to remember, if it's men or women that enjoy a beer, that beers are, usually contain gluten. you can get gluten-free beer. They're very expensive. So those are just some of the common things to watch for. Okay, now on the cost issues, non-celiac, again, celiac, yes, they've got to go all the way. Non-celiac gluten sensitive, don't need to buy those. I mean, I've seen certified gluten-free oats, a can of them costing like $14. And yes, when somebody switches over to a gluten-free version of bread, it's much more expensive. Those packages of cookies are an arm and a leg. The gluten-free pizzas, all of those products are more expensive, but typically we're controlling for quantity due to carb load on those foods anyway. So just you can help manage costs by the fact that you're not going to be eating as much of them. And rely more on your fresh foods like rice and potatoes for your starchy foods is a very easy way to help control costs. And then there are little tricks, things that I do just to lower carb load anyway, like add zucchini when I make pasta. I make it half and half with gluten-free pasta and half zucchini. It's a great, or in the initial phases, we might have people use all zucchini as a low-carb pasta replacement, and it's cheap. The other thing is you can watch for gluten-free foods at discount stores. They have more and more gluten-free foods at the big box stores like Costco and Sam's Club, and I see gluten-free foods in stores like Big Lots and Odd Lots all the time. So there are ways to get around, some of the costs. It's really not hard to overcome. Okay, so just to kind of summarize, again, cow's milk and wheat, both eliminated, makes it much easier. Because of interaction on the yeast, gut flora, low sugar diet also helps people be much more successful on a gluten-free diet, especially if they're using it to address celiac or irritable bowel issues. One other thing I wanted to mention, when people do an elimination diet, and especially if they have other food allergens issues, is that they'll tend to move to this new set of foods that they eat, and they eat them over and over and over again, and eventually, let's just give an example. This isn't a good example, but let's say somebody switched over to using a lot of tapioca. They could become reactive to tapioca as a result because of tapioca flour is used as a gluten wheat replacement in a lot of gluten-free products, and it's used now in that cheese. They could over time. So one of the things just to be aware of is the fact that we really recommend rotation of foods as a method for preventing development of allergies to the new set of foods that you eat. And this is just coming from years and years of experience. If we've seen this quite a few times. Someone needs to go off of peanuts and they start eating almonds, and the next thing you know, they're allergic to almonds. So what we recommend, especially in high allergen food categories like nuts and seeds, rotating the types of nuts that they eat and not just always eating almonds, for example. I do have a couple of case studies. I know we're getting a little bit long on time. I'll try to do a real quick recap of these and then open up for a few questions. My first case study is an 18-year-old female that came in with us with primary complaints of diarrheal dominant IBS, headaches, very fatigued, not able to sleep was a big issue. On further questioning, we found out that she had the rash on the backs of her arms, the keratosis pilaris, and she's overweight despite the fact that she works out regularly. High stress perfectionist. When we looked at the labs, we started to, what their concern was that in this young woman, these triglycerides and the lipids were really starting to go out of balance. So she had all these bowel symptoms, and she had been advised by a chiropractor to get tested for gluten and for other allergies. She had the Cyrex lab test done, but she said that they did that gluten-free diet and it didn't make any difference. They said they also avoided dairy and soy. Yet when I dug in and did a food recall, I found out that she actually had been eating dairy, like things like Havarti cheese, and had been using whey protein for some protein shakes. So we recommended recommitting to this gluten and dairy-free diet. When she had tried to do it before, she had done it on her own. And what she was able, the difference was for coming into our clinic, we had our metabolic code diet materials all printed out with sample menus, and she was able to be a lot better at truly being gluten and dairy-free. On the next slide, this is just a quick rundown of the supplements that we put her on. Because of those thyroid numbers that I don't have time to go into in depth, we put her on some nutrients for thyroid hormone production support. Glucoreg is a product with alpha lipoic acid and chromium and some other ingredients for blood sugar regulation. We put her on Bliss, which contains some 5-HTP to help with sleep at bedtime. And then we addressed the gut issue by going on probiotics and a product that had cat's claw in it for anti-yeast properties. And you see some further changes in the supplements, but move on to the next slide. By doing a proper elimination diet, both wheat and dairy out of the diet, gluten and dairy, I should say, diarrhea and headaches resolved within 4 weeks, sleeping much better even before the diarrhea completely resolved within 2 to 4 weeks. And it took a couple, 3 months. We had to add some adrenal support in there, but then we started to see energy getting better, and they started to notice the rash on the back of her arms was clearing. Now, one of the things we did not see in this patient was weight loss. We found out she wasn't measuring starches when she did add them back in, and honestly, she really didn't want to lose weight. She was happy with her weight where it was. So we haven't found out yet if we've been effective on the lipids yet, the triglycerides. We're going to do those measurements again soon. The second case study is an 18-year-old male who came in with complaints of low stamina in sports, was injury prone, having problems sleeping, and feeling like he wasn't really growing for as much as he could be for his age and for his genes, I guess. Because we found some things in this young man, like the injury prone, and he was also anemic, we recommended celiac testing. He had no GI symptoms, but yet he came back positive for celiac. So the primary program was gluten-free diet, and then we used supplements. We can go on to the next slide with a gut emphasis supplements, L-glutamine, cat's claw, and Dr. O'Hara's is a probiotic, as well as another probiotic called Chiodophilus. For the increased stamina, we added Cordymax, and this particular patient was, their family was in a multi-level marketing company that has a nutrient pack called Life Pack, and just for general nutrition, you know, good vitamin mineral intake, he stayed on that, and there was a fish oil in that as well. So that list of supplements was the list for the first year, and then we switched to a customized nutrient formula that we did through compounded nutrients, where we put the multivitamin mineral ingredients in along with cat's claw and cordyceps. And then he took a separate probiotic. The case study, the diet for this case study, typical intake before was a lot of fast food, a lot of gluten, and we asked for dairy and gluten-free, low sugar, and the patient was very good on the gluten avoidance, but not as good with the dairy avoidance. Over time, he also began to figure out how not to eat so much sugar. And our results were great. Started sleeping better pretty quickly, gained 10 pounds in a year. In a year and a half, he had actually grown 1.5 inches and had gained another 8 pounds, so a total 18-pound weight gain. And the biggest thing was that finally feeling that the energy and stamina was coming around. It took a good year for that to happen. At 18 months, the client wanted more weight gain, so we started to look at total calorie intake because he just wasn't a real big eater. So we counseled on that, and we used a homeopathic support for a product that's known for appetite improvement. So again, just to wrap this all up, gluten-free diets usually will be more successful when they're also dairy-free. We always need to do some carb control on them, at least the sugar, and then the other carb control depending on what the person wants for their weight. The other thing I want to mention on this, if you eliminate wheat and dairy and you don't see pretty significant improvements, then you may want to screen for other food allergies. They may be allergic to eggs or corn or tomatoes or something like that. Okay, so what to do next? You know, one of the reasons we wanted to do this webinar is because we know a lot of you out there, especially in integrative practices, are trying to implement elimination diets for your clients, and they can be particularly hard to do. That's why we put all these materials together to make a diet like this more accessible for integrative medicine practitioners. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. If you're interested in helping your clients to explore whether they may benefit from a gluten-free diet, the metabolic code diet is gluten-free, and it lumps in the other factors that people need to improve their chances of success. That is that it's dairy-free and it's low glycemic. So for those of you that if you're already, signed up and using our lifestyle guidance portal, the metabolic code diet is one of the options that you can access with your account. If you are not already using it, you can find more info about the metabolic code diet at metaboliccode.com. So either way, thank you for attending tonight. We appreciate it very much. My next webinar is going to dig in a little more on the metabolic code diet, all the features of it, and why they're helpful, why they're needed, what they will help your clients with, for different clinical issues. We're going to touch on the topic of resistant starch a little bit next time within that, but I later on have a whole webinar on resistant starch itself, and how to kind of help your patient get that diet implemented. So walking a patient through the diet. And if you're interested in sitting in on that webinar, you can go up on metaboliccode.com and register for that as well. I think we're going to open up and see if anyone has any questions.
Laura, we've got a question from someone that was pretty generic. They wanted to know, they had come in late, would they be able to listen to the webinar afterwards? And the answer is yes. Okay. We have recorded it, and we'll make it available through the Metabolic Code website and to anybody who is registered for tonight. And I wanted to point out, somebody had asked Laura about the date for the Metabolic Code diet, where you're going to cover that in more detail.
Okay, March 12th, 1 month, we'll be going over that. In between, Jim Lavalle, my husband, has a webinar, and I believe he's talking about sleep protocols, how to be more effective when your clients are having problems sleeping. So that's in 2 weeks.
Okay, and those are both on the metaboliccode.com events page if you want to find a link to register for those. Or one other question I see here on the list of questions is about Ezekiel bread. Are there any Ezekiel bread varieties that you can find that are gluten-free, or are they all wheat-based?
Yes, they have finally come out with wheat-free versions, gluten-free versions. So there are versions of sprouted grain breads now that are gluten-free, and that's been fairly recently. It's been really the last year or so that I've started to notice them, but they do have them now. They never used to, but they do now. Same, I forget the brand name, but the one that you see the most, they've now come out with gluten-free version, yes.
Okay, well, that wraps it up. I don't have any other questions that are in writing that you didn't already cover tonight. And unless you have any other closing remarks, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. We had a great turnout, and we'll be doing a continuation of this Metabolic Code webinar series pretty much every week or so And if you're on the list that we're sending announcements to, that's great. We'll send you announcements of upcoming webinars, and we'll also be posting those on metaboliccode.com. So Laura, thank you so much for speaking tonight, and thank you everyone for coming to listen to this great content.
You're welcome, John. And thanks, everyone.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.